The ground cracked open on the last night of the old world. And what came out of it was not what anyone had been afraid of. Byron Harkin had been watching the sky when it happened. He did that sometimes, stood with his neck bent back and his coffee going cold in his hand, staring up at whatever the dark had to offer. His daughter Kara said it was because he was looking for something he'd lost up there. His new wife Lena said he was just being dramatic. Byron said nothing, because the truth was he didn't know what he was looking for. He just knew that the mountains felt safer than the cities on a night like this one, and the sky above the Sierra Diablos was clearer than anything he'd seen in years. And if the world was going to end because some programmer in 1972 couldn't be bothered to add 2 digits, he'd rather watch it happen from somewhere quiet. The campfire had burned low. Kara was asleep in the tent. She'd given up arguing about whether 17 was old enough to stay up past midnight somewhere around 11:30, which was progress. Lena sat beside Byron on the log, her shoulder against his, her breath making small clouds in the cold. She'd brought a bottle of red wine from the city, the good stuff, and they were working through it, with the kind of slow deliberateness that comes when you're not sure whether to be afraid. 1 minute, Lena said. Byron looked at his watch. The second hand swept. Somewhere down the mountain, something shifted in the earth, the faint groan of deep stone, and Byron told himself it was nothing. Old mountains made noise. That was all. Midnight. The fireworks in the valley below started up. Pops and distant color. And nothing happened to the power grid, and nothing happened to the water treatment plants, and nothing happened to the satellites. Because nothing was ever going to happen, and they both laughed, the same laugh. At the same moment, the laugh of people who had let themselves be afraid of something ordinary, and Lena put her head on Byron's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and for about 45 seconds the world was very good. Then Kara screamed. Not a small scream, not the scream of a 17-year-old startled by a raccoon, the full-lunged, everything wrong scream of someone looking at something that should not exist. And Byron was on his feet, and moving before the sound had finished leaving her mouth, the wine glass turning, end over end in the dark behind him. He didn't make it to the tent. They came out of the tree line, like they'd been waiting there for hours, which they had. 4 of them, then 6, moving fast and low and carrying mismatched weapons, a shotgun, a tire iron, something that might have been an axe handle. And they smelled like old wood and rancid meat, and something underneath both of those things that Byron's brain categorized as wrong, and then stopped trying to process, the varick. He didn't know that word yet. He would learn it. First one hit him across the shoulders with something heavy, and he went down into the dirt and tasted pine needles and his own blood and heard Lena shouting somewhere behind him and Kara's scream cutting off mid-note, which was worse than if it had kept going. He tried to get up. One of them put a boot on his back. Casual and confident, the way you'd hold a door open. Not cruel, just certain. Byron lay there with his cheek in the cold earth and looked sideways and saw the campfire, still burning, and thought, I should have listened to the mountain. Dr. Mara Solis had been tracking the varick for 11 years. She had a file 4 inches thick. She had photographs that the university's ethics board had confiscated twice. She had seismic readings from 6 countries, soil displacement data from 3 continents, and a recording, 47 seconds of audio taken in a copper mine in northern Chile, that she'd listened to so many times she sometimes heard it in her sleep. A sound like stone breathing, a sound like something enormous turning over in the dark. The varick were old. Not old the way institutions are old, or trees are old, or even mountains are old. Old the way geology is old. Old the way the concept of patience is old. They went dormant in cycles that made the ice ages look like a weekend, and when they woke hungry, and the world above them was always different from the world they remembered, and they had never once adjusted their behavior to account for that difference. She'd tried to tell people. She'd given a paper at a symposium in Oslo in 1994. She'd sent letters. She'd called a journalist who specialized in environmental fringe science, same one who'd broken the story about the deep-sea thermal vents. And he'd said it was interesting and then never written the piece. The problem, she'd come to understand, was not that people thought she was wrong. The problem was that people thought the universe was tidy. They thought something that big would have been noticed, They were wrong about that. Things that move slowly enough become invisible. You have to know what you're looking for. She was parked on a dirt road 3 miles from the Sierra Diablos campground when her seismic reader went, occasional tremors, to a sustained, rhythmic vibration that she recognized immediately, the same way you'd recognize a song from the first two notes. "Oh," she said quietly, to no one. She put the truck in gear. They kept the Haskins, Byron, Lena, and Kara, in what had once been a bunkhouse at the edge of an abandoned mining settlement, a collection of structures that had not been officially inhabited since 1923 and had been very unofficially inhabited since sometime in the 1950s by the Varick's human servants. Because that was what the Crawford clan was, though they didn't know it themselves. They thought they were chosen. They thought the great trembling in the earth was their God speaking. They'd built their entire culture around being present and useful and compliant when the sleeping thing beneath the mountain finally woke. The man they sent to guard the bunkhouse was named Billa. He was tall and quiet, and moved like some grown up in a place with low ceilings, perpetually half-ducked, and his eyes had the specific blankness of someone raised to believe that questions were a form of disrespect. He sat outside the door and sharpened a knife that didn't need sharpening, and he didn't answer when Byron spoke to him. Byron spoke to him anyway. "You've been up here a long time," Byron said through a gap in the boards. "Your whole life, maybe. It's the farthest you've ever been from these mountains." Billa's knife stopped moving. "I'm not trying anything," Byron said. "I've got a bad knee and my hands are tied and my daughter's asleep against my shoulder, and I can't move without waking her up. I'm just talking. Can ignore me if you want." Billa looked at the knife. He didn't say anything, but he also didn't start sharpening again. "She's 17, said. "Kara, she's reading Ursula Le Guin right now, has been for a month. She reads slow, likes to think about things. She wanted to stay home tonight, actually. I talked her into coming. Told her the mountains were better than the city for something like this." The knife went back into the sheath. Billa stood up. Byron thought, "Good, I've annoyed him. He's going to walk away." But Billa didn't walk away. He turned so he was facing the gap in the boards, and he looked at Byron the way Byron had looked at the sky earlier, searching for something he couldn't name. "The thing in the ground," Billa said. His voice was lower than Byron expected. Rougher, like he didn't use it much. "You know what it is?" "No," Byron said honestly. Billa nodded, as if that confirmed something. "None of us do," he said. "Not really." And then he walked away, and Byron sat in the dark with his arm around his sleeping daughter and thought about the thing in the ground that none of them understood. The earth cracked at 2:17 in the morning, 3 miles to the northeast. Mara felt it in her back teeth. She was out of the truck before the sound finished rolling across the valley. A deep concussive boom that sent birds screaming out of the tree canopy, quarter-mile in every direction. She had her recorder. She had her camera. She had, at the last moment, presence of mind to grab the flare gun from the glove box. Not because she thought she'd need it for safety, but because light was about to become important. The thing that emerged from the earth did not look like an insect exactly, or like anything exactly. It was composite, the kind of organism that evolution produces when it has been working undisturbed for long enough that all the original constraints have been dissolved. 12 limbs, segmented, the outer 2 pairs modified into something between a flipper and a blade. A thorax the size of a city bus. A head, if you could call it a head, that moved with a slow, sensor-rich deliberateness, tracking vibration and chemical signal and heat simultaneously. Eyes that were not eyes in any vertebrate sense, distributed across the body in clusters, each one capable of independent orientation. It stood in the crater of its own emergence and breathed the new air, and the cold of it moved Mara's hair from 40 meters away. She took the shot. She always took the shot. If you didn't have documentation, it hadn't happened. Then she started walking toward the mining settlement, because the seismic data had told her where the secondary emergent sites would be, and there were people in those buildings, and someone needed to make sure they understood what was happening. The first wall of the bunkhouse came apart without warning, not explosively, not the way walls come apart in movies with a concussive blast and a slow-motion spray of debris. It came apart the way wet cardboard comes apart. pulled back by something with a casual thoroughness. And the cold night poured in and Kara came awake with a gasp against Byron's shoulder. "Don't move," Byron said. The thing outside did not make a sound that categorized. It breathed, or processed the air, did something that served the same function as breathing. And the sound of it was geological, patient, ancient. One of the modified forelimbs reached through the gap and probed the interior of the room the way you'd probe a dark cabinet with your hand, not searching exactly, more surveying. Lena had a pocket knife. She'd had it out since they'd been put in here. She'd been working at the rope on her wrists, in short increments whenever she thought Byron or Kara wasn't watching, because she didn't want to give them hope she wasn't sure she could deliver. She'd gotten about halfway through the first strand. She looked at Byron. Byron looked at the forelimb. The forelimb found Billa. Billa had come back some time in the last hour. Byron had heard him settle outside the door. Again, the familiar scrape of his boot against the boards. He'd been there when the wall came apart. And now the limb found him the way a tongue finds a loose tooth, with a kind of reflexive interest, and Billa made a sound. Not a scream, a flat exhalation, a sound like surprise, and then the limb withdrew and took him with it. "Silence, Lena," Byron said. "I'm working on it," she said. The Varric did not have a concept of war. This was one of the things that made it so difficult. Mara would explain later, in papers that nobody published, and lectures that nobody attended, and in a self-funded documentary that somebody's algorithm accidentally recommended to 7 million people in a single week. The Varric did not have a concept of war, because war implied that the other party was capable of meaningful resistance, and in the Varric's experience, spanning a timeline that encompassed the evolution and extinction of multiple prior dominant species on this planet, nothing had ever offered meaningful resistance. They were not cruel. They were not malicious. They were not even indifferent. Exactly. They were like a geological process. They were like a tide. They moved through the world, and the world rearranged itself around them. And then eventually they went back into the earth and slept for another 1,000 years. And whatever had rearranged itself either recovered or it didn't. The Varric that emerged in the Sierra Diablos on the first morning of the new millennium was mid-range by the species standards. Young, relatively, still in its first 10,000 years, which meant its sensory apparatus was still developing, its behavioral patterns still somewhat flexible. It found the smell of humans interesting, in the way a cat finds a paper bag interesting. It had encountered something like humans before. The Varric's geological memory recorded the presence of prior hominid species, though nothing as chemically complex as the current model. And it was curious, in the incurious way that vast ancient things are curious, about what the new version could do. It pulled Billa out of the ruins of the bunkhouse and held him up to where its distributed sensor clusters could process him. And Billa hung there in its grip and did not scream, because the Varric's grip produced a chemical signal that read to the human nervous system as absolute calm, the way a spider's bite numbs before it hurts. He hung there looking at the sky, which was starting to go pink at the edges, and he thought about the mountains, which was all he'd ever thought about, and then he thought nothing at all. The Varric set him down, gently, and moved on. Byron got the ropes off, not quickly. Lena had gotten the pocket knife free and cut her own bonds and then worked on his while Kara kept watch through the gap where the wall had been, giving them quiet updates in a voice so controlled it made Byron's chest hurt. "It's over there. It's moving left. It's stopped." Like a wildlife observer, like someone narrating a nature documentary, his daughter. When his hands came free, Byron spent exactly 2 seconds shaking the blood back into his fingers, and then he stood up. The micing settlement was chaos. The Varric had moved through the Crawford compound with the same methodical curiosity it had applied to the bunkhouse, and the results were everywhere. Structures pulled apart, vehicles overturned, a water tower lying on its side in a creek bed. Some of the Crawfords were running, some of them weren't. Billa was sitting against the outside wall of a collapsed shed, alive, eyes open, looking at the sky, the same way Byron had been looking at the sky earlier. Byron stopped when he saw him. "Can you walk?" Byron said. Billa looked at him. Something had changed in his face. Not the blankness was still there, but underneath it something had shifted. the way permafrost shifts, slowly and with great consequence. It didn't know what I was, Billa said. Looked at me like I was a rock. Can you walk? Byron said again. Why are you asking me that? Because we're leaving and I don't want to leave you here. Billa looked at him for a long moment. Then he put his hand on the wall of the shed and pushed himself to his feet. Mara found them at the tree line. She almost didn't. She'd been tracking the Varric's movement pattern and had estimated incorrectly by about 40 meters. But Kara saw her headlamp through the trees and made a decision without consulting anyone, which Byron noted and did not argue with. You the scientist? Kara said when Mara pushed through the underbrush. What? Mara said. There's a scientist tracking this thing. Heard one of the people from the settlement mention it. Are you her? Mara looked at the four of them. Byron, bruised and rope-burned. Piece of lumber in his hand for no clear reason. Lena, still holding the pocket knife. Kara, Legin paperback inexplicably still tucked in the back pocket of her jeans. Billa, standing slightly apart, looking at the middle distance. Yes, said. I'm her. Good, Kra said. Tell us how to kill it. I don't, Kra started. How it works then, how it thinks, everything you know. Mara looked at Byron. Byron shrugged, the shrug of a man who had learned not to interrupt. Walk and talk, Mara said. We need to get to my truck. They walked. Mara talked. The Varric's sensory apparatus, she explained, was distributed, not centralized the way vertebrate processing is centralized. No brain to injure, no single point of failure you could target. The cluster eyes were sensitive to vibration, to chemical signals, to infrared, frequency range below human hearing that corresponded to the seismic activity of the region. That last one was important. The Varric oriented by seismic signal. It navigated by feeling the shape of the rock beneath it, the way a bat navigates by the shape of the sound bouncing back from walls. So it's blind to anything that doesn't produce seismic signal, Kura said. Not blind, less sensitive. But the mind, Kura said. She'd been listening with the same intensity she brought to Legin, pulling threads, the old copper mine. If there are shafts down there. There are, Mara said. The whole eastern face of the mountain is honeycombed. The Varric came up through there, through the primary shaft. The secondary shafts are still intact, mostly. And if something, Kara stopped walking, everyone stopped walking. If something caused a significant seismic event inside the mine, something the Varric would read as another Varric, a territorial signal, something that said this space is occupied. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. You're 17, Byron said. I'm almost 18, Kara said. She's right, Mara said quietly. If we could produce the right frequency, sustained, consistent, below 14 Hz in the secondary shaft system, it would read to the Varric as a competitor. Something larger occupying the lower chamber. The Varric's response to territorial signal from a same species entity is to withdraw and re-enter dormancy. You could do that, Byron said. Generate that frequency. The mining equipment is still in there, some of it. There are compressors, old ones, industrial. We could get them running simultaneously. The resonance through the shaft system might. She stopped. It's theoretical. Most things are until they work, Byron said. The approach to the mine entrance took 40 minutes. They moved through the pre-dawn dark in a loose file, Mara in front with her headlamp, Kara beside her asking questions in a low voice, Byron and Lena behind, Billa at the rear. At some point during the walk, without discussion or announcement, Billa had picked up a tire iron from the rubble of the settlement. He carried it at his side, with the casual familiarity of someone who had always carried things like that. Lena moved close to Byron and said quietly, You trust him? Byron thought about it honestly. Trust that he's as surprised by tonight as we are, he said. That's enough for now. The mine entrance was a timber-framed arch, set into the eastern face of the mountain, half obscured by 30 years of undergrowth. The timbers had bowed but not broken. Inside, the darkness was absolute, and smelled of copper and old water and the specific mineral cold of deep. Mara went first. The others followed. The compressors were in the second chamber, 40 meters in. There were 4 of them, massive industrial units from the 1940s, designed to pump air to miners working the deep veins. They ran on diesel, and the diesel tanks attached to them were corroded but not empty. The old fuel had turned to something closer to varnish. Mara said that might actually be fine. that the combustion would be rougher and more irregular, which would broaden the frequency range, which was what they needed. Both of you, Mara said to Byron and Billa, the starting mechanisms are manual. There'll be a flywheel on the side of each unit. You have to spin it fast enough to turn the engine over. Takes 2 people. Byron looked at Billa. Billa looked at right. Billa said, I'll take left. They found the flywheels. They were cast iron, stiff with disuse, requiring full-body leverage just to begin moving. Byron put his hands on the spokes and pulled, and pain lit up his shoulder where something had hit him hours ago. And he pulled anyway, because the alternative was not pulling. Billa was stronger than he looked. The flywheel on the right unit began to turn. Mara and Lena were working on the fuel lines. Lena had produced a multi-tool from somewhere. Byron made a mental note to ask about that and was using pliers to crack loose corroded connections while Mara directed. Kara was at the entrance to the chamber, watching the main tunnel, the Legeen still in her back pocket like a talisman. It's coming, Kara said. Not a shout. A statement, the same controlled wildlife observer voice. Byron heard it a second later. The seismic tremor of something massive moving through the shaft system, the groan of old rock adjusting to new weight. The Varric had found the mine entrance. It was curious. It was investigating. How long? Byron said, still cranking. Minutes, Mara said. Maybe less. We need 1 compressor running. That's the threshold. I know, so which one's closest? Mara looked at the right unit. Billa's flywheel was turning faster now. That one, she said. Byron let go of his flywheel and went to help Billa. 4 hands on one wheel, pulling together, and the engine of the right compressor turned over with a sound like a cannon shot in the enclosed space. And then it caught, rough and irregular and wrong-sounding, like it was running on memory more than fuel, and the vibration of it moved up through the stone floor and into the soles of Byron's feet, and Mara pressed her palms flat against the rock and closed her eyes. Is it working? Lena said. Listen, Mara said. They listened. The sound from the tunnel changed. The Varrics stopped. It had been moving through the secondary shaft with the patient confidence of an organism that had never encountered a situation that required hurrying. The shaft was narrow for it. It moved with its body compressed laterally, its outer limbs retracted, the sensor clusters sweeping the rock walls with continuous chemical and vibrational reads. It had found human scent in here, recent, warm, interesting. Then the low frequency hit it, 14 hertz, below human hearing, bone deep and directional, coming up from the rock below and to the east, resonating through the limestone shelf in exactly the pattern that the Varric's distributed nervous system recognized, had always recognized, had been recognizing, since before the mountains it was moving through had been mountains. Another one, larger, established, territorial. The Varric stopped moving. It stopped processing the human scent. It stopped being interested in the narrow shaft or the small warm things at the end of it. Its chemistry shifted in a way that Mara would later describe as deflation, not fear exactly, because the Varric didn't have fear, but the functional equivalent, the ancient arithmetic of resource competition that said, this space has a prior occupant, and the cost of displacement exceeds the value of the resource. It stayed still for 11 seconds. Then it began to back out. Kura was the first one to notice. It's retreating, she said, from the entrance to the river. And then, a moment later, yes. It's going back. Nobody moved for a moment. The compressor ran. The stone vibrated. Byron sat down on the floor of the mine, which was cold and damp and absolutely the best surface he had ever sat on in his life. Lena sat down next to him. She put her head on his shoulder, like she'd done earlier, before any of this, which felt like it had happened in a different century. He put his arm around her. Billa stood apart, listening to the fading vibration, and something moved through his face. Not what you'd call emotion exactly, more the preliminary erosion that sometimes precedes emotion, the way a coastline changes before anyone thinks to call it change. It didn't know, he said, all those years, generations of my family. We thought it knew us. We thought we were. He stopped. It looked at me like a rock. Byron looked at him. Yeah, he said. We built everything around it. I know. Billa turned the tire iron over in his hands once, then set it carefully against the wall of the mine. Upright. Like he was putting something down that he didn't plan to pick back up. What happens now, he said. We walk out of the mountain. Byron said. That's the next thing. Dawn came while they were walking. The Sierra Diablos looked like they always looked at dawn, cold and enormous and indifferent in the way that beautiful things are indifferent. The valley below was catching the first light. The mining settlement was rubble, but the trees around it were untouched, and the creek was still running, and a pair of hawks were doing slow circles above the ridge. The Varric had gone deep enough that the birds no longer read it as a threat. Mara stopped at the tree line and looked at the crater where the creature had emerged. It had collapsed back on itself when the Varric retreated, not all the way. There was a scar in the earth 20 meters across, but the primary shaft was no longer open to the sky. The mountain had partly swallowed itself again. She took a picture. She always took the picture. Byron stood beside her and looked at the scar. How long before it comes back, he said. 1,000 years, give or take. Be longer if the territorial signal persists. The compressors are still running. They'll keep running until they run out of fuel. By then the frequency will have imprinted on the limestone. It might hold for decades. Might. Science, Mara said. Which was not exactly an answer, but was, Byron thought, an honest one. Kara appeared beside him. She pulled the Ligin out of her back pocket, looked at it. The cover was bent now, and there was a dried smear of something on the spine that she didn't examine too closely, and then tucked it away again. I think, she said slowly, that I want to study this. Horror B-movies, Byron said. Xenobiology, she said, or something like it. Whatever the actual science version is. Astrobiology, Mara said. Close enough. Kara looked at her. Were you the only one? Before tonight, the only one who knew. Mara thought about the file 4 inches thick. The confiscated photographs, the unwritten article, the unattended lectures. 47 seconds of audio that sounded like stone breathing. Yes, she said. That must have been lonely. Mara looked at her for a moment.
What?
Not anymore, Kara said. And she said it the way 17-year-olds say things when they mean them completely, without irony, without hedging, as a plain statement of observable fact. Mara looked away. She put her camera away. She did something with her face that was not quite a smile, but was in that neighborhood, on the same street, visible from the window of a smile. They walked down the mountain as the sun came fully up. The world had not ended. The Y2K bug had done nothing. The computers had rolled over, and the networks had kept running, and the lights had shone in every city. Infrastructure had held. Because of course it had. Because the programmers had fixed it. Because that was what people did. They found the problem. And they stayed up for 3 days, and they fixed it before it became catastrophic. They were quiet about it. They didn't get parades. Byron walked and thought about that. He thought about the compressors running in the dark of the mine, filling the limestone with a vibration that said, in a frequency older than language, occupied, held, defended. He thought about his daughter reading science fiction on a camping trip, and ending up being the one who solved the problem. He thought about the fact that the Varric had looked at Billa and seen a rock, and Billa had been insulted by this, and Byron understood the insult, had felt it himself, had felt it in a way that bypassed logic, and went directly into something older and more stubborn. We are not rocks, we are not scenery, we are not background, we are not the soft, temporary things that occupy the surface between your dormancy cycles, indistinguishable from the geological record. We are the things that looked up at what came out of the mountain and thought, how does it work? Are the things that pulled apart the problem in the dark and in the cold, with bad knees and ropes still on our wrists, and built the solution out of old compressors and bent science and stubbornness. We did it in the space of 4 hours, which for us is a long time, for what we were facing was less than the blink of an eye. You were underground for 1,000 years, and we changed while you slept. Changed, and changed, and changed, and every time something came out of the dark, we found a way to be different from what it expected. That is not what rocks do. Billa left them at the base of the mountain. He didn't announce it or say goodbye in any formal way. He just stopped walking at a fork in the path, and stood there while they moved past him. And when Byron looked back, he was still standing there, looking at the mountain above. Byron stopped. You have somewhere to go? No, Billa said. You could come with us down to the valley. There'll be people. I know. He looked at the mountain again. I need to stay here for a while. Think about some things. Byron nodded. That made sense to him. Some things required you to stand in the place where they happened and look at them from the right angle. There's a town, Byron said. 12 miles east if you follow the creek. Billa looked at him. Thank you, he said. Came out like a word he hadn't used in a while, but still remembered the shape of. Byron nodded. He turned and walked down the path. And after a moment he heard Lena's footsteps and Kara's footsteps fall in behind him. And then Mara's. And they went down toward the valley and the ordinary world. Which was still there, which had always been there, which was waiting for them with its petty complications. And its small demands and its absolute ordinary daily beauty. That you only noticed when you spent a few hours in the dark with something that had never thought to notice it at all. The walk down took longer than the walk up. That was always the way of it. Urgency compresses time going in, and exhaustion expands it coming out. Byron's knee was swelling inside his boot. He could feel the pressure with each step, a slow metronomic reminder of what the night had cost, and he walked through it the way you walk through anything you've decided you're walking through, without drama, just the quiet persistence of someone who has accepted the terms and is working within them. Lena walked beside him. At some point during the descent she found his hand and took it, not as a gesture of comfort, more as navigation. They'd been walking separately through the worst of it, and this was the first moment that holding hands was a practical option. Again, which meant they were past the worst of it, which meant something. When we get down, she said, going to need about 400 years of sleep. We don't have that long. I know. I'll take 8 hours and complain about the rest. He laughed. It surprised him, the laugh. It came from the same place the earlier one had come from. The laugh at midnight when nothing had gone wrong yet. But it was a different shape now, heavier, earned. He laughed and Lena laughed, and Kara, walking ahead, turned and looked back at them with the particular expression teenagers make when their parents are being embarrassing, which was so completely ordinary that it nearly broke him. Normal, still normal. They were still capable of normal. That was the thing nobody understood about humans. Mara was thinking, further up the path, watching the 4 of them below her. 5, including herself now, though she was still getting used to that. Nobody understood that the most important thing about human beings was not there. Adaptability in the face of catastrophic threat. That was real. That mattered. But it was downstream of something more fundamental. The most important thing was the speed with which they returned. The speed with which they allowed themselves to find something funny in a situation that should have left them catatonic. The speed with which a man with rope burns on his wrists extended his hand to the person who'd put them there. The speed with which a 17-year-old started thinking about graduate school 40 minutes after closing a cave on a creature the size of a building. Other species, Mara had studied the evidence, had spent 11 years reading geological memory in rock cores and soil chemistry. Other species that had encountered the Varrock in prior cycles simply did not recover. The behavioral data was in the sediment layers. Population collapses, abandonment of settlements, complete cessation of complex activity in the affected region for centuries. They encountered the Varrock and became something smaller than they'd been. The encounter left a mark that lasted longer than the encounter itself. Humans, Mara thought, watching Byron and Lena hold hands on the dark path, were going to be annoying about this. In the absolute best possible way, they were going to be impossibly annoying about it. They were going to write papers and hold hearings and develop early warning systems and debate the ethics of the compressor solution and build a museum at the site and argue about the design of the museum for 30 years and then open it. Anyway, imperfect and full of opinions, and school groups would visit it, and someone would write a bad movie about it, and someone else would write a better book, and Kara would read it and have notes. They were going to metabolize this. Not because they were braver than anything that had come before. Not because they were smarter or stronger or less afraid, but because they were constitutionally, almost pathologically incapable of treating a problem as larger than their capacity to engage with it. They just kept going back to the wall and finding new things to try. It was, Mara thought, either the most beautiful thing she'd ever witnessed or the most exhausting, possibly both. She was increasingly unable to tell the difference. The valley road came into view at 5:30 in the morning. There was a gas station at the junction. A small one, a family operation, the kind that still had a pegboard price sign with plastic numbers. The lights were on inside. Through the window, Mara could see a teenager behind the counter, watching a small television. And on the television, in the stuttering light of early morning news coverage, she could see the split screen, footage of celebrations from cities that had made it through the midnight rollover without incident. And in the corner of the screen, indistinct aerial footage of a mountain ridge with a new scar in it, helicopters circling, the Chiron below it reading unusual seismic activity in Sierra Diablos region, authorities investigating. The gas station teenager looked up when they walked in. He was maybe 19. He had the specific 1,000-yard stare of someone who had been awake for 22 hours, running a gas station on the theory that the apocalypse, if it came, would probably need fuel. He looked at Byron's rope burns and Lena's pocket knife and Kara's bent paperback and Mara's camera and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "You folks want coffee?" Byron looked at the others. "Yes," said Kara. The teenager poured 5 cups. He didn't ask questions. He slid a bosocked granola bars across the counter without being asked. He'd opened it for himself at midnight and hadn't finished it. He turned the television up slightly so they could hear what the news was saying about the mountain, and then he leaned on the counter with his elbows and watched it with them, like this was just another strange night, at the intersection of something and something else. Byron wrapped both hands around the paper cup. The coffee was bad. The kind of bad that comes from a machine that had been running since 1994 without a deep clean. And it was the best coffee he'd ever had because it was hot and it was real and he was alive to drink it. And outside the window, the sky was going from black to the specific gray-purple that comes just before the sun commits. "What do they know?" Lena asked, nodding at the TV. "Unusual seismic signature," Mara said, "consistent with a subterranean void collapse, which isn't wrong, technically. They don't know what it was. Not yet." Mara looked at her camera. "They will." Kara was watching the helicopter footage. The aerial shot showed the scar clearly. A raw gouge in the eastern face of the mountain, the edges already beginning to soften in the low angle of the approaching dawn. From above it looked like an accident, something the mountain had done to itself. "How many of them are there?" Kara said. "The Varric, total." Mara was quiet for a moment. "The seismic record suggests at least 40 emergent sites globally," she said, "that we can identify. The actual number is probably higher." The gas station teenager slowly turned his head to look at her. "But they move in cycles," Mara said. "They don't all emerge simultaneously. The Sierra Diablos site was an isolated emergence. The rest are still dormant. The frequency imprint in the mine buys us time. Local time, but time. Time for what?" The teenager said. And his voice was very steady, the voice of someone who had decided that if the world was going to get strange, he was going to stay with it. "Time to do what we always do," Kara said. She picked up her coffee. "Figure it out." She said it the way she'd said everything else that night. Plain, unembellished, as a statement of observable fact. No bravado, no declaration. Just the quiet, almost annoying confidence of someone who had seen the mechanism of the problem exposed and had taken a mental photograph of it and would now spend the rest of her life developing that photograph in a darkroom of her own making. The gas station teenager nodded slowly. He reached under the counter and produced a second box of granola bars. "In that case," he said, "you're going to need more of these." Byron called his brother from the payphone outside. He hadn't thought about his brother in hours. Hours that had swallowed large portions of what he would later think of as his ordinary life. The life that existed before he'd heard his daughter scream from a tent in the Sierra Diablos. His brother lived in Sacramento and had spent the previous night watching a countdown on television with his wife and their 2 kids. And when Byron's voice came through the line at 5:45 in the morning, his brother said immediately and without preamble, "Where are you? Are you okay, Kara?" "We're fine," Byron said. "We're all fine. There's news coverage. The mountain. I know. We're coming down. We'll be at the Valley Junction in an hour. There's a gas station. Can you?" "I'm already in the car," his brother said, which was not possible, because Byron had called him 45 seconds ago, and his brother's house was an hour and a half from the mountains at best. Byron believed him absolutely, without hesitation, because that was the other thing about people. They did not wait to be asked twice. You said you needed them, and they were already in the car. The physics sorted itself out after. He stood at the payphone with his hand resting on the receiver after he'd hung up, looking at the mountain above the valley. The scar was visible from here, a faint darkness against the paling face of the rock. The helicopters were tiny from this distance, hovering. He thought about the Varric in the mine shaft, stopped by 14 hertz coming up from the rock below. Something larger, the frequency said. Something occupying this space. Something that was here before you, that will be here after you, that has laid its claim in the bedrock itself. It hadn't been true. It was 4 aging diesel compressors running on varnished fuel, and a seismic researcher pressing her palms against the floor of a cave to see if the math held. But the Varric's ancient, distributed nervous system had felt it through the stone, and the stone did not lie, and so the Varric had believed it, and had backed away from the thing it believed, and that was enough. 14 hertz. 4 compressors. 1 year of field work that no one had taken seriously. 1 teenager who had read enough science fiction to ask the right question at the right moment. 1 man who had, for reasons he still couldn't fully articulate, told a captive hostile that his daughter's name was Kara, and that she read slowly because she liked to think. 1 woman who had set down a tire iron like it was something she no longer needed to carry. Byron looked at the mountain for another moment, memorizing it. The shape of the scar, the angle of the light, the specific color of the sky at the moment the night decided to stop. Then he went back inside to where the coffee was. Mara's paper was published 14 months later. Not in a major journal, she'd stopped expecting that, but in a mid-tier geobiology review that had an editor with an unusually high tolerance for paradigm-challenging submissions. The paper was titled, with the sort of pedestrian scientific naming conventions that make genuinely extraordinary findings sound like annual reports. Seismic territorial signaling and behavioral inhibition in subterranean megafauna, a case study in the Sierra Diablos range. It got 12 citations in the first year, then a Reddit post, then a YouTube video with a thumbnail of the crater, then 7 million views in a week because of someone's algorithm, then a congressional hearing, which Mara testified at in the same flannel shirt she'd been wearing in the mountains because she owned 4 shirts and this was her best one. She brought Kara with her. Kara was in her first year of graduate school by then, studying things that didn't have official names yet, in a department that was being hurriedly assembled by a university that had suddenly found itself with significant federal funding and a mandate to figure out what was living under the earth and how to talk it out of coming back up. Kara testified too. She was calm and precise, and answered the senator's questions without condescension, which was more than most of the other experts managed. Afterward, in the hallway outside the hearing room, a reporter asked her what it felt like to be at the center of what people were calling the most significant scientific discovery in human history. Kara thought about it for a moment. She thought about the dark of the mine and the cold of it, and her father sitting on the floor with his arm around her stepmother, and Billa setting down the tire iron like he was putting down something that had been too heavy for too long. She thought about 14 hertz moving through limestone. She thought about the paperback in her back pocket she'd finished on the train to Washington, finally. It felt, she said, like we figured out the problem before it became catastrophic. The way you do. The reporter waited for more. That's it, Kara said. That's the whole thing. She put her hands in her pockets and walked down the hallway, past the marble and the flags, and the portraits of people who had, in their own generations, stood in front of things that should not have been survivable, and found the solution in the time they had, with what they had, which is the oldest human story, and the only one that has ever actually mattered. The compressors in the mine on the eastern face of the Sierra Diablos ran for another 6 weeks before the fuel finally gave out. By then the frequency had imprinted on the limestone. The Varric did not come back.